Warning. This episode contains frank discussions of race and racism that some may find challenging to listen to. Listener discretion is advised. But it also contains stories of overcoming challenges that some may find to be inspiring. Enjoy.
On this episode of Race, Health, and Happiness, Dr. O speaks with Ritu Bhasin, lawyer, author, and inclusion specialist, about finding your authentic self, growing up caught between cultures, and how staying healthy can be a revolutionary act.
By me being well and thriving, that is the fundamental step for interrupting white supremacy. As long as I, as a person of color, a woman of color, am thriving and doing my best because I am well, I am winning and I'm disrupting the system.
The Race, Health, and Happiness podcast is hosted by Dr. Onye certified public health physician specialist and family doctor. The views expressed by Dr. O's guests are their own and do not necessarily represent her opinions or those of the podcast. Check out the show notes for more details. And now, here's Dr. O.
Hi, my name is Dr. O. Welcome to my podcast, Race, Health, and Happiness. We live in a world where Black, Indigenous, and people of color are more and more aware of the blatant and subtle ways that systemic racism impacts our lives. As a doctor, I'm interested in how racism affects people's health. This podcast is about to stay healthy and happy despite all that noise. My guest today, Ritu Bhasin, is an expert on overcoming, thriving, and disrupting that noise. She is a South Asian Canadian woman born and raised in Toronto. She followed the expected path and became a lawyer, but then realized her true calling, which was to become a people strategist and inclusion specialist. In our conversation, she will walk us through her journey and describe her work in this emerging field. Ritu is also a leadership and empowerment coach, having helped hundreds of professionals to leverage their strengths with a focus on leadership, empowerment, and strategy. And as if that wasn't enough, she also authored a book called The Authenticity Principle: Resist Conformity, Embrace Differences, and Transform How You Live, Work, and Lead. Ritu, thank you so much for joining us. I'm excited.
Oh, Dr. O, I'm excited. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. So in this podcast, I always start off with my guests reflecting on what makes each person special. And so my big question to you is, what is your superpower?
Such a big question. So I would say the thing that I think serves me the most is my intuition. I am highly, highly intuitive. But when I dig deep into it now and the way in which I look at it, it's me really just feeling and sensing my own energy, but also feeling and sensing other people's vibrations, nonverbal communication in particular. When someone's around me, we haven't even spoken and I can feel a vibe coming off of them and myself as well. And then I can adjust and manage my behavior accordingly.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question then, because what I've been working with my students on is the area of emotional intelligence, right? And the way I teach it is really being self-aware and having that self-management, and then being socially aware and that social management. And so that seemed in line with what you described. Is that fair to say, that it's a kind of more intuitive form of emotional intelligence, of EQ? Is that fair to say?
So I'm all about, so I was born in Canada of Indian immigrant parents, like my parents are from India. And so my formal education has been through an Anglo-Western, I'm in quotes, lens, but my spiritual heartbeat, the blood that runs through me, comes from a very Eastern way of living and being. So here in Canada, we would talk about the five senses. Back home, it's not five senses. There's a sixth sense, or there are multiple additional senses that we possess that enable us to intake data from the universe and categorize it, store it, retrieve it, and then function. And I would say emotional intelligence is one piece of it and absolutely goes hand in hand. Empathy would be connected to it. Self-awareness would be connected to it, but recognizing that we are sensing and feeling our way through all of our interactions with ourselves and others, and EQ is a piece of that.
So then I really like that, because it's like, yes, it has a piece of EQ, but it's beyond that, and it's beyond kind of like that Western construct of it. But nonetheless, you talk about it being at its height. So you're, your highest point of superpower when you're well and you are fully yourself. So on that though, I was thinking about the opposite side to things, right? So when I think of a superpower, I also think of everyone has their kryptonite. Everybody has moments that kind of create vulnerability. And so you weren't always thriving and shining like you are today. There were times in your life where your bright light was dimmed by your experiences. Do you want to talk a little bit about that as, first generation South Asian, young girl growing up in Canada?
Sure. And I should say, in this moment, like as I sit here right now, here with you, but on a whole, like in this place in my life right now, I am thriving and flourishing, and I feel really empowered. And in tandem, I have dark moments, and I feel like my life can be really hard and challenging. I didn't know that when I was younger, though. When I was younger, I struggled a lot. I talk a lot about this in my book, The Authenticity Principle. I talk a lot about it in my videos and blogs online. As a child of immigrant parents, my parents coming from India, as mentioned, I grew up in Toronto proper, so like in Scarborough, raised the roof.
Hey,
yeah, right, in the house. And when I was around the age of 11, my parents made the very strategic decision to move us to the whitest place that they could move us to. And we're Punjabi and we're Sikh. And when I say Sikh, my faith is called Sikhism. I am a Sikh. My father was a turban. The women in my family all have long hair.
Because I know what you're referring to, but just
So Sikh is spelled S-I-K-H, and we are reclaiming the correct pronunciation. So it's Sikh, not Sikh.
Thank you.
And so they moved us to Unionville, Ontario, which at the time was extremely affluent, very white, WASP in particular. It was a massive financial stretch for them to do that, but they did it because they wanted us to access better education and access social networks they didn't have access to, and also to learn how to shift cultural codes, because as brown-skinned kids growing up in white Canadiana, they knew that would be an important skill to possess. They didn't have it. They wanted us to have it.
And that's the dream for many immigrant parents, actually, mine included. It's just, to acculturate and have, the best possible outcomes that they think are the best possible outcomes.
Yeah, and 1,000%. And to be frank, I don't think my current success would have happened at the rate or the pace it did had I not learned how to shift cultural codes and receive the education that I did, the quality of the education and all of that. So they were spot on in many respects. But the problem is, in moving us to a really homogeneous neighborhood or community, I experienced a lot of bullying and racist childhood bullying at that.
Can you give an example?
So from about the age of 11 to about the age of 15 or 16 in particular, I had everything from physical bullying, but it was the emotional and social isolation aspects of bullying in particular that were really challenging. So for example, in grade 6, there was the I Hate Ritu Club, and you were either in the club or you and were protected from bullying, or if you were not in the I Hate Ritu Club, well, you would have been bullied as well. And so
there was a club.
There was a club in the class, and so
created
I literally
against you.
Precisely, I literally had no friends. I was the only girl of color, and I looked very different. I dressed different. I ate weird things by their standards. And I can remember hanging out behind the portables alone, recess after recess, to protect myself from bullying. But as we now know from multiple studies, that social isolation really harms and hurts us. And I carry the trauma of the childhood bullying experiences with me even now. I mean, I'm a lot better because I've done extensive therapy and healing work to help me address the woundedness that came from the racism I experienced as a young child. And that was just as a child. Like, I could go on at length about overt and direct, and then more importantly, systemic and structural racism that I continue to experience as a woman of color, navigating the global business community. But I didn't know at a young age how to deal with it or address it. Whereas now, as I sit here, because of wanting and because of believing in my ability to be beautiful and knowing that I had lightness within, I was committed to healing, and I was committed to cultivating my wellness. And then also I recognized early on that by me being well and thriving, that is the fundamental step for interrupting white supremacy. As long as I, as a person of color, a woman of color, am thriving and doing my best because I am well, I am winning and I'm disrupting the system. When I am down on the ground, if I am not healing, if I am not doing my work, if I am not being well by choice, then I'm feeding into the system. I didn't know that as a youngster. I know it now.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. I'm going to dig in there a little bit because I think when we use the word white supremacy, sometimes people get the image of like hate groups. Exactly.
Yeah.
But is that what you're referring to? Or are you referring to kind of the systems and structures? Where you say white supremacy or interrupting that?
So I work as an equity, diversity, and inclusion speaker, author, activist, coach, a blogger. And when I'm talking about white supremacy, I'm talking about the ideology or belief that we hold consciously and unconsciously. We hold this in our minds and bodies, and every single person on this planet holds this, that white people and whiteness is better than being a person of color or an Indigenous person. So it's an ideology or belief. Now, the KKK, white hoods, they are manifestations of white supremacy. But I think that because we're so used to white supremacy being referred to in the context of talking about hate groups, we shun the use of the language and then therefore don't properly understand the systemic underpinning. It's an ideology. It's quite simple. It's that white people are better than people of color and Indigenous peoples. And that ideology permeates everything.
Okay, so thank you for clarifying there. The other thing that I want to dig into is that, clearly you're talking about different identities that you hold, right? So there certainly was as the South Asian girl in school. But then for a lot of us who are the children of immigrant parents who do have, that great Canadian dream, when we come home, there's a different intersection. There's a different identity that we have. And sometimes it can be, that we're between cultures almost, right? So can you speak to, yes, you talked about being that child who was, hiding almost, trying to not get bullied. And then when you would return home, was there an understanding of what you were facing as a quote unquote brown girl? And I'm using brown as race here rather than ethnicity. Yeah. What was the understanding at home?
Oh, such a good question. I have a video on my website, on my YouTube channel about this, where I call it my ethnic identity crisis. I deeply struggled with my ethnic and racial identity growing up because at school, because of racism, I had to push down my brownness and I had to embody whiteness. And again, for those of you listening, I'm doing the
air quotes,
like whiteness, and where it's like started pushing my parents to let me bring bologna sandwiches to school as opposed to goat curry and basmati rice in like a little container, and I dropped any kind of marker of brownness other than skin as much as I could as a way to say, no, I'm just like you. Like, yeah, I look brown, but I'm like actually really white in my heart.
Yes, I fit in.
I fit in. So good. But fitting in will never replace actual belonging. But I'd go home at night and my parents were really cool and keen with us being immersed in Canadian, that's the whole reason they came to Canada, to have a better life for themselves and their children, their unborn children. And they were like, go join student clubs and get out there and be really active and be Canadian. But then when I bring home my Canadian values of being mouthy and direct and wanting to date boys and have a phone in my room, it's like, think 80s, and go on sleepovers, they were like, hells no, I don't think so. Or we're coming with you. Like the whole tribe is going to come to the sleepover. So I was
Just
like,
bring everybody to the sleepover.
Like, right? Like, what is that? And I'm like, if I wasn't being bullied already, like it's going to be epic levels of bullying now. And so I deeply struggled. And not only did I just struggle in terms of like culture on the home front, in terms of like embracing my parents' culture, and I was struggling at school with like trying to be white even though I wasn't. I also felt intra-group bullying in that at my school, there were very few brown kids, like in high school. My parents' family friend circles that we hung out with on weekends, I was really nerdy. And so like the brown kids there were kind of like, you're not really cool. So they didn't really like me either. And so I just felt rejected a lot. And I felt alone a lot. And actually, in high school, the community of color that was the most populous for me were the West Indians and the Caribbeans at the time. And they took me in. And it's making me emotional. I felt belonging with other cultural communities. Now I knew I wasn't Black, so let's not get confused here. Let's not get it twisted. I knew I wasn't Black. I knew that I was a friend and a guest in a community that had invited me in, that was taking me in, and it felt beautiful. And because I felt understood and seen, and as I gained confidence within that circle of friends, I expanded out, because then there were more Indian people coming to my high school, and I befriended more Indian people, and I had some white friends and some Asian friends, and it just spread. But here's what I learned. My ethnic identity crisis, being bicultural, like being born of Indian parents, but growing up in white Canadiana, was real. And I now have come to see, and in my video, I talk about how I'm a mishmash of cultures. So look, I know I'm South Asian, and even in particular, I don't really even identify with South Asian. Like I'm Punjabi and I'm Sikh. Right. I'm also Canadian, but I'm also a woman of color. Like I love that I can go to a Bhangra Jam one weekend and a Soka Fete the next weekend. I love that my East Asian friends, I can celebrate Chinese New Year with them or go for dim sum, and then I can kick it up and then do something different culturally. So I now have come to experience belonging in multiple settings with people, which I have created. And I think this is a really important point.
Yes, no, I think that is a beautiful thing, because you talk about feeling between cultures and not really fitting in anywhere. And then now feeling different forms of connections in different places 100%. And spaces. And so that is a really, really great lesson. The other one that I wanted to ask you about is that you also are very vocal about your experiences with like mental health and struggling with that and overcoming in that realm, in a very kind of also multiculturally faceted way of addressing that. But can you speak about that? Because I think some of our listeners, sometimes people are struggling with mental health and then don't know the different opportunities open to them that might come from, the Western culture, Eastern culture is all different cultures. So maybe can you speak about, I think what I remember you talking about mainly was when you were, we're going to fast forward to university, when you were in university and a law student, or I think applying to law, right? And there was a time where you felt quite low and then were able to come out of that. So maybe could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. I struggled with belonging, racism, and more when I was in my teenage years, including having moments of being suicidal. It wasn't until I was at U of T in my undergrad, I was around 20 years old, when I was working really hard, desperately trying to get into law school, feeling tremendous pressure and stress on related to that, but also I had family stuff going on and relationship stuff going on. And being 20 is really hard. Like, let me just say, like, straight up, like I say this as someone who's in my 40s. I hear the 70s are the best. Bring it. The 40s, pretty good so far. I'm liking it. My 20s were my hardest. It was the worst. So if you were in your 20s listening and you were like, my life sucks, I hear you. Believe me, do your work and it gets better.
It gets better.
Sidebar, I had to say that because, like, I just remember when I think of myself in my 20s, I'm like, OMG, poor thing. Like, oh, I could give her a hug.
Yes, yes. Anywho, it gets better.
It gets so much better, but you got to show up and you got to do your work.
Yes,
like,
yes. So, yeah.
Right. So I was trying to get into law school and I was deeply struggling. Like, I could tell my mental health was off. And someone suggested that you could go and see a therapist on campus, and it was free. And I was like, my immigrant upbringing, I'm like, bling, bling, ding, 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 free. I'm down, bring it. Like, the school's gonna pay for it? Hells yeah. So I went, and I have never looked back. I have now had over 20 years, pockets of therapy for over 20 years. And when I mean therapy, I'm talking about like Western style cognitive behavioral therapy, Gestalt therapy, talk therapy, where I'm one-on-one with the therapist. My partner and I go to couples therapy as a way to keep our relationship healthy and strong. I have done myriad other forms of therapy as well, though stepping outside of the Western Anglo model. And I do a tremendous amount of body work. So yoga in particular, and the meditation that flows from yoga was invented by my people, even though culturally appropriated by the West now, 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, and it runs in my body. And so I am not only a yoga and mindfulness practitioner, but I also teach it. I've studied it, and I bring that into my teachings. I do a lot of that, but I do spend a lot of time with body work because, as we know, trauma lives in the body, not just the mind. And my experiences with trauma in particular, like, I can tell when my nervous system is activated, and building a more healthy and coherent nervous system is one of the best things that we can do to navigate through the world and be well. And so body work for me includes everything from acupuncture, massage, Reiki, and other work that I have to pay experts to do, which is expensive. And at 20, I may not have been able to do it. But I do a lot of other stuff that's free, like dance.
Hey, you hear that? We're getting that as a theme. A lot of people are saying dance as staying well. So
right?
Please speak to that.
Well, dance. So I always loved to dance. I didn't realize this, but now that I'm studying to be a trauma therapist, and in particular because I want to heal my own trauma, but specifically I want to help people heal their racial trauma as a byproduct of being on the receiving end of bias and forms of racism oppression, where when we experience events that cause our nervous systems to dysregulate, as you may know, the energy gets trapped in our bodies, and anything that we can do to literally discharge the energy is helpful in healing. From a very young age, I've loved dancing. Like, I literally felt like it would set my body free, and I would just feel so much more relaxed after a big night out of dancing. And now what I can see is that, like, I literally literally shake energy, negative energy, out of my body when I'm dancing.
Right.
And here's the fascinating thing, Dr. O. So many of us come from ancient and indigenous cultures where our practices for hundreds and thousands of years have been rooted in a way to help us heal the body and keep the body strong. These practices were vilified by colonizers, were appropriated by colonizers, and we have lost touch with these practices. And then in the cultural appropriation piece are now being packaged by people who don't own our cultural practices and sold back to us. And now we're opening our eyes up to it. And it's like, those are our practices. Like, our people invented this stuff hundreds or thousands of years ago. And we know this intuitively because it lives in our bodies, because we come from those bloodlines. Those are the very same practices that can help to heal us and keep us strong and resilient in the face of the garbage we experience.
I am just like blown away by your summary of that. I think certainly when you talk about the negative energy, like, we know that from the science there's that fight or flight response when we're experiencing microaggressions and things like that. So you've got all of this energy packed into you. So yes, ways of kind of releasing that, it makes sense that dance would be one of those ways, or something physical. Now, I'm going to now take it up another notch and get into the kind of work that you're doing now and the book, right? So when we think about authenticity, because what you're talking about is kind of reclaiming your own history and identity, but in a context of understanding all of these different cultures and different places and spaces that have influenced you. And that makes you entirely you. But how did you figure that out? What is the authenticity principle?
Sure. So the authenticity principle is an ideology rooted in this idea that when we be who we are as much as possible, it literally causes us to live better. Like, it increases our happiness, our mental, physical, spiritual health, and more. And so I define the authenticity principle as our commitment to choosing to know who we are, to embrace who we are, and to be who we are as much as possible so that we feel better about ourselves. We bring this spirit into our interactions with others. And because authenticity is like a magnet, it's contagious. When I'm doing this with you, you'll be more drawn to do it back with me. Because of this, we'll build far more meaningful relationships. And then ultimately, when we're like living and working and leading with this spirit, we end up creating a world and workplaces, societies, families, and more that are rooted in feeling inclusive and empowered and innovative and creative and so much more.
Now, that sounds amazing. I think that's what we all aspire to do, but it is hard work. Where you say you have to do the work. You had trained as, to be a lawyer, and you worked as a lawyer, and then you eventually felt that that wasn't your true authentic self or what you felt that you wanted to fully bring to the world. So that it takes work, as we talked about in the 20s, work to get to that point of, realizing who you are and seeking that authenticity. Would you agree?
100%. So based on my work and research, what I have come to see is that the being on the receiving end of bias, judgment of others, racism, other forms of oppression, that is what causes us to suppress our authenticity. We, in fear of being judged, we push down our differences. But my message to you after today is the following. I want you to live your best, especially for those of you who have experienced a lot of bias, racial bias in particular. I relate, I can understand. Do your best to be as physically, mentally, and spiritually healthy as you can, because when you are in mind, body, and soul strong and healthy, when you experience forms of oppression, it will be easier for you to deflect their impact, or if you are triggered into fight, flight, or freeze, you'll be better equipped to come out of that. And then the second piece that's so important to me is that when we are mentally, physically, and spiritually strong, that is when we are best able to be authentic and be who we are and bring our cultural differences to bear. And for me, as part of systems disruption, I want authenticity for as many of us as possible.
All right. Well, one last question before we end. What brings you joy?
Connection. I feel like when I meaningfully connect with people, like deep in my heart and soul, it literally fills my cup with love. Like, there is no better feeling than knowing that you have deep, meaningful connection, for me anyhow.
Thank you, Ritu. We are so just feeling blessed to have you on the show. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I feel blessed. Thank you.
Now I'd like to give my perspective on the conversation we just had. Ritu talked about a number of different factors that can help us be well and overcome in a racialized world. In particular, what resonated with me were 3 key messages that she gave. One around authenticity, the second would be in finding connection, and the third would be getting help when we need it. For the first, for authenticity, I think it's really phenomenal how over time she was really able to find her inner voice and express that. And so for all of us, I think it's really important to find opportunities and ways to express our genuine selves that are true to our values and our way of being. I think it can be a tricky space to figure out over time. And so it is a journey. But what's really nice is that Ritu, aside from this interview, has been sharing that journey and that wisdom online. So we'll put the resources in our show notes. But overall, I think looking to understand ourselves as individuals and then find ways to be the greatest expression of ourselves through authenticity is the direction that can help us all in our wellness and in our journey and contributing to our communities. So the second major message that Ritu spoke about was connection. She even talked about her superpower being intuition, but that really is in her connection to other people. So social connectedness is really a key factor that I picked up on, because there is a lot of evidence to support the need to have social connectedness. But in particular, actually, I would say the evidence around loneliness, the opposite of connection, is even more compelling. So we know that in Canada, there's been quite a bit of research showing that beyond causing heightened rates of depression, anxiety, and irritability, loneliness is now being associated with potentially life-shortening health issues such as higher blood pressure, heart disease, and obesity. Specifically in Canada, studies have shown that 1 in 5 Canadians identify as being lonely. And in the United States, nearly half of Americans are reporting they feel alone, isolated, or left out at least some of the time. So certainly feeling alone, I think that happens to all of us, but taking the time to seek connectedness has been shown to improve well-being. And I think that sometimes it's a journey. Even in Ritu's examples, there were times that she did feel alone, but she stayed committed to trying to find connectedness, either with people who were similar to her or people who were different than her. And I think that's really the key. It's really like not giving up and really trying to continue to reach out. And on the topic of reaching out, I think that was actually the third key message that I thought was really important, which is getting help. So when we are feeling down, when we're not feeling like ourselves, today we talk about mental health more and more, but I think that's because people are becoming more and more aware of their experience of either feeling depressed or low. And so when we're feeling like that, I think it's important to seek help. And there's different ways to do that. So using a multicultural lens, it might be looking for mainstream approaches, and that's what Ritu has done. She has sought therapy, but also with that multicultural lens, looking for other forms of either peer support from people who might have experienced similar things than you might be experiencing, or looking to other ways of healing like meditation or yoga, or, she talked about dance, but finding really positive ways to cope where you're not causing yourself harm, but finding ways that fill your spirit and help you improve psychologically, physically, mentally, or spiritually. And, my personal experience has been that I have found it really helpful to do a combination of those different types of things. Where I've felt down, I've sought, mainstream therapy, but I also, enjoy dance, practice meditation, I've practiced yoga. And so I'm committed to my wellness and exploring different approaches in that way. I'm curious about your own journeys. I'm sure some of you have found really positive ways to overcome and thrive. So I look forward to hearing about your own journey and your own tips or tricks for staying well. This is Dr. O, and I am wishing you health and happiness on your journey.
The Race, Health, and Happiness podcast was created by Dr. Onye, and she's our host. The show is produced, written, and edited by yours truly, Dr. Carl Cabasel. Our technical producer is Obadiah George. Associate producer is Shamipe Oni. Original music and our theme song composed and performed by Gold Keys. If you're looking for a little slice of audio happiness, you can check out his music on Spotify and YouTube, or just Google him. That's Gold Keys, all one word, ending with a Z. Do you have questions, feedback, ideas to share? We'd love to hear from you. You can connect with us on Instagram and Twitter at RaceHealth&Happy, and check out the show notes for research that was referenced in this episode, as well as other bonus material. Our website is RaceHealth&Happy.com. Thank you for listening to Race, Health, and Happiness, and please subscribe to us anywhere you get your favorite podcasts. I'm Dr. Carl Cabasel, and we'll talk to you soon. coming up on a special bonus episode of Race, Health, and Happiness. Dr. O speaks with Director X, internationally acclaimed film and music video director, about his efforts to use brain science to stop the violence, and how he realized too late the power of meditation.
I wish I knew about this in my 20s. I was buck wild. You know, so I'm been in my 20s all my life. What that could have meant.
Subscribe to Race, Health, and Happiness on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere you get your favorite podcasts. And visit RaceHealth&Happiness.com for bonus material and notes about each episode.